When global star Margot Robbie buys lunch for a homeless man outside a cafe in Los Angeles, she doesn't suspect that before her stands a legend of the 90 seconds rock scene, whose name has been erased from history. Jack Mercer, once a brilliant guitarist, now hides the scars of his past under a tattered cloak, and instead of strings, holds the notes of a song that could have changed everything. But one random act of kindness sets off a chain of events, old enemies, forgotten recordings, and a voice that refuses to be silenced. Can a man who has forgotten how to believe in himself pick up the guitar again? And what secrets does the quiet producer, long collecting lost souls, hide? A story about how the pause between chords can become the start of a new symphony. Stay with us if you want to find out how this story ends, and don't forget to subscribe. Los Angeles breathed contrasts. The sun, like a gilded disc, hung over boulevards where neon signs of clothing stores for those who have arrived flickered. The air smelled of roasted coffee, expensive perfumes, and the faint smoke of someone's unfulfilled dream. Margot Robbie walked down Melrose Avenue, wrapped in a light scarf, as if trying to hide not so much from the paparazzi as from her own fame. Today, she chose a cafe without star reviews. A place where waiters didn't ask if she wanted the chef special, like in that DiCaprio movie. She sat at a window table, watching the city kaleidoscope spin without pause. Girls in athletic leggings discussing yoga retreats. Businessmen in suits worth 3 average salaries flipping through bills. And somewhere between them, like a shadow, he moved. The man stood against the wall of the neighboring building, leaning against the brickwork that might once have been red, but now resembled ash. His hands, wrapped in worn, fingerless gloves, clutched a guitar, or rather, its ghost. No strings remained, only the fretboard, scarred like a musical staff recording a history of falls. He wore a cloak the color of a stormy sky, and Margot thought it was probably the last item in his wardrobe still resisting time. She noticed his fingers first. Even beneath the dirt and cracked skin, there was a muscle memory. They involuntarily plucked imaginary chords, like a pianist deprived of his instrument. His lips moved, repeating lyrics to a song that only he remembered. Margot froze. In her world, where every gesture was calculated for the cameras, such sincerity seemed almost indecent. The waiter brought her order, a latte with oat milk and a quinoa salad. Margot pushed the plate away, suddenly realizing how absurd her healthy choice looked compared to what was happening outside the window. She pulled out a notebook, black, worn, bought once at Heathrow Airport before filming as Tanya Harding. On the first page was written, "Character is what remains when fame fades." She traced the letters with her finger, as if checking they hadn't faded. When she stepped outside, the wind caught her scarf, and for a moment she felt the city was trying to stop her. The man by the wall didn't look up, even when her shadow fell on his guitar. Perhaps he was used to people tossing coins like dice, without hope of winning. "Would you like some lunch?" Her voice came out softer than she intended. He slowly raised his gaze. His eyes were the color of the sea after a storm, blue-gray, with streaks of yellow near the pupils, as if sun rays from long-gone days were trapped there. He didn't answer, just nodded, and in that movement was the weary gratitude of someone who had long stopped expecting questions. Margot returned to the cafe, ordering 2 turkey sandwiches and a thermos of soup. As the cook prepared the food, she watched the man stroke the guitar's fretboard as if it were the hand of an old friend. Suddenly, he began to hum. The melody was barely audible over the street noise, but Margot recognized it, a 90 seconds ballad her mother played while cleaning the house. It was knocking on heaven's door, but not Dylan's version. It was rougher, with a rasp that only comes from singing thousands of notes. His fingers clenched into a fist as he reached the chorus, as if his body remembered where the climax should be, but his soul refused to follow. Margot approached, setting the bag of food and thermos before him. "Take it," she said, but he was no longer looking at her. His gaze was fixed on the guitar, as if seeing not wreckage but a mirror. She wanted to leave, but something made her turn back. He pulled a folded sheet of paper from his pocket. Unfolding it with trembling hands, he revealed handwritten notes with annotations. "Take an octave higher here. Pause 2 beats. The ink was smudged from rain or tears, but he stroked the page as if it were a treasure map. At that moment, Margot realized, before her was not just a homeless man. He was an artist whose canvas had been stolen, but who still tried to draw with his fingers on the dusty asphalt. She turned away, feeling a lump in her throat. On the street corner, a street musician played a jazz improvisation on his saxophone. The sounds mixed with the noise of cars, the cries of seagulls, and the soft hum that still hung in the air like an unspoken prayer. As Margot got into a taxi, she saw the man carefully unwrap a sandwich, break off a piece, and place it on a paper napkin beside him, a gesture full of unexpected dignity. He tucked the sheet of notes into his inner pocket, where perhaps concert tickets or letters from someone who believed in his talent once resided. The taxi pulled away, taking her back to a world where guitars were always tuned and voices never lost their power. But for the rest of the day, Margot's fingers tapped out the rhythm of that ballad on her knee, and in her notebook a new entry appeared. Sometimes angels wear tattered cloaks and sing in raspy whispers. Somewhere in the city, on a bench in Griffith Park, the man finished the last bite of his sandwich, wrapped his guitar in the thermos's plastic, and held it close like a child. Above Los Angeles, the streetlights flickered on, and their glow, mixing with the neon, made his cloak look like a starry sky for a moment. Los Angeles never sleeps, but in the pre-dawn hours it at least pretends to breathe deeper. The facades of skyscrapers fade, muted by the haze, and the sidewalks, still warm from yesterday's sun, hold the imprints of thousands of stories. Margot walked the same route as always, past storefronts with mannequins in eternal triumph, past graffiti depicting a crying clown with the words, "Laugh until you run out of air." But today, her steps slowed by the wall where he had stood the day before. Emptiness greeted her. Only a scrap of newspaper, stuck to the bricks, fluttered in the wind, trying to become an origami bird. She bent down and picked up the crumpled sheet, a menu from a cheap pizzeria with a musical staff drawn on the back. 3 bars, no more. A melody cut off mid-phrase like its author's life. She was about to throw the paper away when she noticed the signature in the corner, J. Mercer, 1997. The ink had faded, but the letters retained the pressure of a hand that wrote them not for accountability, but for eternity. The name rang in her memory like a string plucked in passing. Jack Mercer, a session guitarist for the Crimson Hours, a band whose platinum albums gathered dust in the vinyl collections of her producer friends. The same Mercer who disappeared after the '99 tour, leaving behind only rumors of an overdose somewhere in Nevada. Margot clenched the menu in her fist, feeling the paper dig into her skin. She looked around, across the street. In the window of a thrift store, hung a Fender Stratocaster from 1983, red with scratches on the body like nail marks. The tag read, "Belonged to a member of a legendary group." The price was equal to 3 of her designer bags, but the guitar had been there for years because in a city where futures are bought in bulk, the past is an unwanted stepchild. Rain began suddenly, large drops pounding the asphalt like fingers on an out-of-tune piano. Margot ran to the same café where she had bought lunch the day before. Through the windows, fog from the temperature contrast, she saw him. He sat at a corner table, clutching a thermos with both hands as if it were the Holy Grail. His guitar lay on the neighboring chair, wrapped in a plastic bag, a pitiful shroud for what was once an extension of his soul. A cardboard bowl of half-eaten soup stood on the table, and next to it, neatly parallel to the edge, lay the sheet of music. Margot entered, letting the door chime announce her presence. He didn't look up, but his shoulders twitched, a reflex of someone too often chased from warm places. She bought 2 cappuccinos, though she hated foam, and sat across from him, slowly pulling out the chair so as not to startle the silence. His fingers hovered over the notes. They trembled, not from cold or hunger, but from what musicians call emptiness tics, when the body remembers a rhythm that is no longer there. On the back of his hand, Margot noticed a tattoo, a violin clef intertwined with barbed wire. Old work, the colors faded to blue-green shadows. He looked up. Today his eyes held none of yesterday's foggy detachment, only a sharp, almost animal wariness. Margot pushed the cup towards him. Steam rose, drawing invisible notes in the air. "You played with the Crimson Hours," she said, not as a question, but as a statement, as if afraid that doubt would shatter the fragile thread between fact and person. His eyelid twitched. He reached for the guitar, but instead of unwrapping it, simply placed his hand on it, like a doctor on a dying patient's chest. "They died. The band." His voice sounded like the creak of unoiled hinges. "Not metaphorically. The drummer hanged himself in a hotel room in Dallas. The keyboardist drank himself to death. He coughed, the sound like an overloaded amp's crackle. "I just got stuck in the pause." Margot looked at his neck. Beneath the dirt and sunburn, a faint scar was visible. Thin as a string, it circled his skin as if someone had tried to cut off his voice but changed their mind at the last moment. He suddenly laughed. The sound was bitter, like dark chocolate mixed with ash. "You know what's funny? They called me Ghost. At concerts, I stood behind a black curtain so my silhouette wouldn't distract from the vocalist. But when I played a solo," his fingers twitched, tracing an arpeggio in the air. "They screamed like the devil himself had touched their hearts. And then that bastard manager said my face didn't sell, cut me out of the albums like an appendix." Outside, the rain intensified, turning the city into a gray watercolor. Somewhere, a siren wailed, blending with the street noise into a dissonant chord. Margot pulled out the crumpled menu with his notes from her bag. He shuddered, seeing it, as if it were a letter from another life. "This is Starless Night," he whispered, touching the notes with a trembling finger. "I wrote it after we got kicked out of a hotel in Seattle. We slept in the van, and through the broken window, we could see the stars falling. Thought it would be our ticket back." He fell silent, swallowing a lump of memory. His hand clenched into a fist, pressing the paper to the table, as if afraid the wind would carry away the last proof of his existence. Margot stood up, leaving her coffee untouched. As she turned to leave, she saw him staring at the notes, his lips mouthing words that thousands of fans once screamed. His guitar, wrapped in cheap plastic, cast a shadow on the wall resembling an angel with broken wings. The next day, she returned with a volume of Bukowski's poems. In the book's pocket was a business card from her friend, the owner of a recording studio who collected lost souls of rock and roll. She placed the book next to his guitar while he dozed, curled up on a bench. When he woke up, he found the book. On the end paper was written, "Sometimes a pause is just a fermata before the climax." There was no signature, but he recognized the handwriting, the same angular letters as in the café note. As he opened the book, a guitar pick fell out, gold, engraved with the words, "To play louder than fear." He flipped it over. On the back was the logo of Phoenix Records, the same studio where his idols recorded in the distant 80s. In the distance, thunder rumbled, but this time it sounded not like a threat, but like a drum roll before a solo. Los Angeles greeted Jack with a dawn that painted the sky the color of a bruise. He sat crouched against the wall of the same cafe, clutching a golden guitar pick. The engraving "To play louder than fear" dug into his palm, as if trying to stitch the words into his skin that he couldn't bring himself to say. Beside him lay a book by Bukowski. Its pages, swollen with moist air, rustled like the wings of a bird that had flown into the wrong place. He ran his finger along the edge of the pick, remembering the first time he held one at 16. Back then, it was the key to a universe where fading lights in basement clubs seemed like stars, and the scent of cheap beer mingled with an aura of immortality. Now, this shiny fragment of the past burned his skin, reminding him that even gold tarnishes if not polished with action. His guitar, still wrapped in plastic, leaned against the wall like a silent reproach. Jack touched the fretboard through the plastic, feeling the roughness left by the years. Suddenly, he tore open the bag. The plastic ripped with a crunch, like applause. The fretboard lay bare, naked and scarred, but in the cracks of the rosewood, traces of lacquer glimmered, once shimmering under spotlights. He stood, clutching the guitar to his chest, and walked towards Phoenix Record Studio. The streets, still empty, reflected in the windows like the set of a play where he had forgotten his role. At the intersection by the station, a stray dog howled at a taxi, its siren wailing, and this duet sounded like a cover of his inner soundtrack. The studio was housed in a building that was once a cinema. The neon sign Phoenix flickered erratically, like the heart of a mechanical bird. Jack froze at the entrance, his breath fogging the glass door, behind which the silhouettes of equipment loomed. A moment later, he was running back, the guitar banging against his ribs, and the pick slipped from his hand, falling into the storm drain with a soft clink. That night, he returned to his bench in Griffith Park. The full moon, indifferent, illuminated a pizza box containing his treasures. The crumpled sheet music of Starless Night, a chocolate bar wrapper, a gift from an old lady at the soup kitchen, and 3 guitar strings found in the trash can outside a music store. Jack took a string, aligned it with the fretboard, and laughter burst from his throat, hoarse, mad. Once his hands danced across the frets, but now he couldn't remember how to tie a knot. Dawn found him asleep, embracing his guitar. In his dream, he was back on that stage in Seattle, rain of stage lights, the roar of the crowd, and a solo that rose to the heavens like smoke from a bonfire. He woke up to a thud. Teenage skaters, laughing, had thrown an empty soda can at him. Sweet liquid soaked the sheet music. Days passed like sand through a cracked hourglass. Jack began to notice that the city spoke to him in hints. A street saxophonist played a melody from his old album. In the window of a used bookstore, he glimpsed the cover of a magazine with the face of his former manager, arrested for fraud. Even puddles after the rain formed the outline of a treble clef. One evening, as the sun sank into the Pacific, painting the sky the color of old copper, he heard a guitar. The sound came from the open windows of Phoenix Studio, vibrant, bold, with bending notes that cut through the air like a diamond through glass. Jack closed his eyes. His fingers moved on their own, repeating the passage, and a lump formed in his throat, like an unsung chorus. He didn't notice how he reached the door. His hand instinctively reached for the bell, but instead touched something solid, a golden pick taped to the door. A scrap of paper beneath it read, "Ghosts welcome, especially those whose solos set the sky on fire." Inside, it smelled of old wood, incense, and the dust of magnetic tapes. Jack stepped into the hallway, where the walls were plastered with posters of bands that no longer existed. Among them, he saw himself, young, with a guitar slung over his shoulder, in a faded photo from a '98 concert. The caption read, "Jack Ghost Mercer, the one who played between the lines." Applause echoed from the studio. Someone shouted, "That was freaking brilliant!" Jack pressed himself against the wall, suddenly aware that his shirt smelled of dumpsters and his boots left dirty tracks on the blood-red carpet. He ran until he hit the dead end of an alley, cluttered with equipment boxes. He sat on his haunches, trembling hands pulling out the guitar. The string quivered under his touch, making a sound like a moan. The second strike louder. The third, and suddenly a voice responded from the darkness. "D," said Margot, stepping out of the shadows. She wore a leather jacket, holding a cup of coffee, and looked as if she had been waiting for him all this time. Jack didn't look up. His finger plucked the string again. "B flat," he muttered, and it sounded like a confession. Margot sat down next to him, ignoring the dirt. She pulled out a new pick from her pocket, black, engraved with "Pause is also a note." "Sometimes," she began, looking somewhere above the rooftops, "to hear the music, you first need to stop fearing the silence." She stood up, leaving the pick on the box. Her footsteps faded, but the echo of her words lingered in the air, mixing with the hum of the streetlights. Jack took the pick. The black plastic was warm, as if charged with someone's resolve. He pressed it to the string and struck. The sound, pure and sharp, cut through the night like a knife through butter. The second strike, and somewhere a dog barked in response. The third, and a window in the building across the street flew open, someone shouting, "Shut up, mutt!" He laughed. For the first time in years, his laughter wasn't tainted with bitterness. His fingers moved along the fretboard, searching for familiar notes. The strings cut into his skin, leaving red streaks, but the pain was sweet, like in the days when calluses on his fingertips were his badges of honor. In the morning, they found him asleep by the studio door. In his hand, he clutched the black pick, and on his chest lay the guitar, now strung with 3 new strings, shiny, like the tears of a phoenix. Los Angeles sang a chorus of car horns, sirens, and wind howling through skyscraper vents, but Jack heard the silence. The same silence Margot had described, thick, syrupy, like tar filling the space between heartbeats. He sat on the roof of an abandoned warehouse where the wind had plastered torn flyers with his own face. "The ghost lives," read one, and Jack smirked, clutching a 3-string guitar to his chest. The strings buzzed with every shift, as if reminding him that even fragments of melody could cut deep. Phoenix Records stood 2 blocks away, but those 500 steps felt longer than the Nevada to Vegas highway he'd once hitchhiked in the back of a circus truck. Every morning, he'd approach the studio doors, touch the air conditioner frosted handle, and retreat like it burned. Instead, he played here on the roof, where his guitar dissolved into the city's noise, free from judgment. One morning, he found a box by the studio door. Inside lay 6 strings wrapped in midnight blue velvet, with a note, "Ghosts need a full set to scare the living." No signature, but the jagged handwriting, cracked like old vinyl, felt familiar. Jack stared at the strings before trying. His fingers, used to 3 metal threads, trembled as he threaded the 4th. The string snapped, slicing his brow. Blood mixed with sweat, staining the guitar pink. The second attempt failed too. He hurled the guitar into a corner where it wailed like a living thing. That night, he dreamed of his manager. The man stood in the studio wearing a suit worth more than Jack's lifetime earnings. "You think strings'll fix broken?" He laughed, scattering sheet music for a starry night across the floor. Jack woke screaming, clutching his guitar like an anchor. By morning, he returned to the box. This time, inside lay a 70 seconds Telecaster, its body scratched as if dragged through gravel. A sticker on the neck read, "Surrendered for repairs. Owner never returned. 2001. Jack ran his fingers over the frets, polished smooth where someone's hands had lingered longer than in their own home. The first chord sounded like an apology. He played facing the wall, ashamed even of his shadow. But the music grew stronger, jagged, like a train bursting from a tunnel. He didn't notice the studio door crack open or the gray-haired man in thick glasses slipping through. "You're playing Starry Night in a minor key," the man said when Jack finished. His voice crackled like a vinyl record. The original was major. Jack didn't turn. Goosebumps rose. He knew that voice. Artie Vander, the sound engineer who'd worked with Nirvana and Soundgarden, a legend whose name he'd once carved into his first guitar. "Major was for them," Jack muttered, gripping his pick until its engraving bit his palm. "Minor's for me." Artie nodded, pulling out a cigarette pack. He offered one, but Jack refused. "I recorded your solo in '98, the take where you mixed up distortion and chorus pedals." Artie blew smoke rings that melted in sunbeams. "It was genius. Like screaming underwater." Jack swallowed the lump in his throat. He remembered the manager screaming about redoing the track, the drummer silently handing him whiskey. "Why'd you never say anything?" he finally asked, turning. Artie was already leaving, trailing smoke. "Real sound's born when everyone shuts up," he tossed over his shoulder. Alone, the silence felt different now, echoing with words he'd waited 20 years to hear. He picked up the guitar, closed his eyes, and started over. Days blurred into rituals, sleeping on benches, washing in fountains, walking to the studio. Sometimes Artie appeared, leaving coffee or fresh strings. Once, he brought a reel of magnetic tape, the '98 take. "Hear this before you break again," he said, slamming the door. Jack threaded the tape into an old recorder. The first notes punched his gut. He heard himself, young, furious, playing like tomorrow didn't exist. Then that moment, the pedal switch, a pause, and yes, genius, a sound like the wail of an angel fallen into hell. When the tape ended, he unraveled it. On the back, red marker screamed, "Come back! Chorus wins." He didn't sleep that night. On the roof, he shredded the Telecaster, blending Starry Night with a new riff sharp as broken glass under boots. A crowd gathered below, cheering bravo at the Phantom concert. At dawn, as the last listeners left, Jack descended to an alley. A 12-year-old girl stood by a dumpster, clutching a guitar. "Teach me to play like you?" she challenged, chin raised. He meant to refuse, but saw his own old fire in her eyes. "Rule 1, he said, handing her a black pick. "Never play for those who can't hear the silence." She struck a chord, sloppy, off-key. Jack laughed. It was a first step, like his own in that moldy basement stinking of hope. Back at the studio, an envelope hung on the door. Inside, a key and a note. "Ghost gotta leave shadows. Rehearsal at 8. Don't be late." Jack rolled the key's teeth, sharp as quarter notes. Sunlight hit the Phoenix record sign. The neon bird glowed brighter, as if flapping its wing. A distant saxophone echoed his night's melody. He walked in without looking back. The door clicked shut, soft as a mic switching on. The stage was smaller than he remembered. The spotlights, once blinding like desert suns, now felt like dim bar lamps. Jack stood backstage, gripping the Telecaster's neck as if his life depended on it. His fingers glided over the frets, replaying Starry Night in minor, the version Artie had called a scream through water. Beyond the curtain, the audience murmured, the rustle of dresses, clink of glasses, laughter polished to a shine. A charity concert for lost talents. The irony made Jack grimace. His outfit, a rolled-sleeve black shirt and faded jeans, reeked of hostile disinfectant. Artie had insisted, let them see the scars, but hear the music. Around his wrist dangled a bracelet of guitar strings, braided by the girl from the alley. Her name was Layla, and she sat in the third row now, a guitar on her lap, bought with money from selling her bike. The curtain twitched. Jack stepped forward, and the light hit him, burning away reality. For a moment he was blind, but his legs carried him to the mic. In the sudden guillotine-drop silence, he heard his own breath, ragged, uneven. The first chord rang out like a gunshot. The crowd gasped, recognizing the melody radio stations had overplayed in the late 90s. But Jack played it differently, slower, twisting major passages inside out, weaving a harmonica's raspy wail into the rhythm. His voice, hoarded in silence for years, broke free, low, cracked, like drought-stricken earth. We fell like stars, burning wings mid-flight. But even ash is a map when there's nowhere left to go. A spotlight caught Margot's face in the front row. Unremarkable in a plain white blouse, her eyes burned brighter than the lights. Jack closed his eyes, letting his fingers guide him through memory's maze, signing a contract at 19 under the manager's mocking laugh. A motel room where his guitar traded hands for a bag of white powder. His first night under a bridge, rain mixing with tears, his phone buzzing with "We don't need you anymore." The music swelled, swallowing the city's hum outside. The Telecaster howled, strings biting his fingers bloody. Jack felt no pain, only the vibration coursing through his bones like electricity. By the third verse, he tore off the pick and struck the body with his fist. The sound, raw and furious, echoed in the silence. And angels fall here more often than rain in the dry season, but even ghosts need fire to cast their shadows. Layla jumped up, accidentally bumping her neighbor's guitar. Her excitement was as wild and unpolished as her playing. Jack caught it from the corner of his eye and suddenly laughed into the mic. The laugh, rough and alive, wove into the melody, transforming it. When the last chord faded into applause, Jack stood hunched over the guitar like it was a fallen enemy. His palms burned, strings smeared red. The crowd screamed encore, but he was already retreating into shadows, stumbling over cables. Backstage, Artie waited with a water bottle. "You mixed up the third and fifth strings midway," he grumbled, but a smirk hid in the corners of his eyes. Jack nodded, relishing the tremble in his forearms. He passed a mirror, catching a glimpse, a man with graying temples, a face lined like old sheet music. But his eyes held a spark no ocean of vodka could drown. At the exit, Layla stopped him. She silently handed him her pick, pink with a unicorn sticker. "Why?" he rasped. "So you remember you're not just playing for ghosts," she blurted, then ran off, blushing to her roots. Margot waited by the service entrance. Her shadow, stretched by a street lamp, pointed like a compass needle. "You came," Jack said, not asking. "I always come when I hear silence tearing apart," she replied, adjusting a scarf the wind tried to steal. They walked in silence, passing alleys where he'd once slept in cardboard boxes. Now, those places felt like props from another play. At the bridge over the LA River, Margot stopped. "You know why the Phoenix burns itself?" she asked, staring at the black water below. "To rise again," Jack answered automatically. "No. To learn that fire isn't the end, just a way to see what you're made of." She turned and left without goodbye. Jack stood, listening as her footsteps dissolved into the city's hum. His phone buzzed, a text from Marty. "Tomorrow at 10, new track, don't be late." On the way back, he saw a man at the subway entrance. Hunched over, a sign reading, "Hungry, any help?" Jack stopped, pulled the pink pick from his pocket, and dropped it into the tin can. "Sometimes a pause is a fermata," he said. The man didn't look up, but Jack saw his shoulders twitch. Home wasn't home. It was a studio attic where Artie let him crash. Jack climbed the stairs, fatigue sinking into his bones. On the mattress lay Layla's cheap sticker-covered guitar. A note was pinned to it, "Teach me bends, or I'll key your car." He fell asleep to the hum of power lines clutching two picks, gold and pink. Below, Artie mixed the concert recording, blending crowd cheers with guitar wails. Outside, Los Angeles continued its endless jazz jam, where everyone was soloist, accompanist, and accidental listener all at once. Los Angeles twisted its streets into a spiral of time, where past and present collided like sound waves in an overloaded mixer. Jack walked down Melrose Avenue, but now his steps beat a different rhythm than before, confident, with the syncopation of hope. His guitar, the very same Telecaster with scratches, hung on his back in a case gifted by Layla. On the case she had written in marker, "No ghosts allowed, especially the cool ones." He turned towards Phoenix Records studio, past the window where a Stratocaster once stood. The guitar was gone, leaving only a dust outline in the shape of a violin clef. In its place hung a poster, a black and white photo of Jack from a concert, with the caption, "Jack Mercer, Requiem for Silence." Art called it low-budget PR, but to passers-by, it was just another poster in a city where stars rose and fell more often than traffic lights changed. The studio smelled of fresh paint and incense. Art believed that the spirits of rock and roll warded off bad sound. Jack entered the room where Layla was already waiting, sitting on the floor among cables. Her guitar, covered in unicorn stickers, lay next to a sandwich with lettuce spilling out. "You're late, old man," she said without looking up from the tabs scribbled in her childish handwriting. He pulled out the sheet music, a reworked, Starless Night, now with a part for a second guitarist. Layla snatched the sheets, her fingers trembling as she mimicked the passages in the air. This is like that riff from my dream," she exclaimed, her voice filled with admiration she usually hid behind feigned toughness. They played until their fingers went numb and the neon crosses of nightclubs lit up outside. Layla messed up a bend, breaking a string, but instead of cursing, she laughed, brightly, like a bell in a heavy metal temple. Jack watched her fumble with a replacement and saw a reflection of himself, young, bold, defying gravity. Up in the attic, where he climbed at night, there were now 2 cots. Layla slept under a Ramones poster stuck to the wall with gum. Jack lay listening to the city's night music seeping through the floor, the bass from the club across the street, the hum of helicopters, the barking of stray dogs. It was chaos, but a chaos in which he had learned to find harmony. One morning, sorting through old reels, they found a recording. The tape was labeled "Starless Night, Final Mix." Art, standing in the doorway, smoked as he watched Jack insert the reel into the tape recorder. The sound hit like a wave. Jack and Layla's guitars intertwined in a dialogue where experience answered audacity and pain met hope. Midway through the track, Layla accidentally bumped the microphone, her laughter crashing into the music, and Art left it in, as a reminder that perfection is overrated. When the track ended, Layla breathed out, "We're like gods." Jack smirked, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Gods don't sleep on cots," he said, but his eyes gleamed with understanding. They had created something greater than music. They had found a language where silence and noise spoke the same thing. Margot Robbie walked the same path as a year ago. The cafe had changed its sign, but the smell of coffee remained the same. bitter, with a hint of cardamom. She slowed down, noticing a man by the wall. His fingers, wrapped in duct tape, strummed an acoustic guitar. A Phoenix record sticker adorned the body. She bought 2 sandwiches but hesitated upon exiting. The man looked up, and in his eyes there was no longer emptiness, only the calm confidence of someone who had found their place in the city's score. "Thank you," he said, taking the food. "You won't believe it, but one person, he changed everything." "Right here," Margot nodded, hiding a smile. His voice held notes familiar to the point of pain. She turned away to conceal the tremor in her hands, and at that moment, the wind carried a melody fragment, Starless Night in minor, played on a saxophone somewhere in an alley. That evening, sorting through the mail, she found an envelope with no return address. Inside was a cassette labeled, "For Those Who Hear the Silence." Inserting it into an old tape recorder, she heard the guitar, the same one that once tried to catch the rhythm on the sidewalk. Jack's voice sounded over the music. "Sometimes angels wear tattered coats. Thank you for letting me hear my own wings." Margot stepped onto the balcony. The city glowed below like a guitar amp left on full volume. Somewhere out there, Jack played for those who still feared believing in the fermatas between life's chords. And she, breathing in the air filled with noise and music, understood. The most important stories aren't written on paper, but in the space between strangers' hearts. And when a distant Telecaster chord blended with the roar of cars, she laughed. Because in that dissonance she heard the most beautiful thing, the unpredictable, imperfect, living symphony of a second chance.